Okay, this is podcast number 13, picking up on the idea of theme. In the last podcast, there was a discussion about how theme actually emerges from the raw emotions of the audience and how creators need to therefore harness that emotion in order to derive the biggest impact. In this podcast, I want to look at the desire for justice, which was discussed in some detail last time, and the other one that works alongside it, the morality of the individual. These two themes underpin a tremendous number of narratives. But before we get down to individual examples, let's look at them in a little bit more detail and how they work. The desire for justice, as I said in the last podcast, is fundamentally about setting out the fact that an injustice has occurred, someone is seeking to correct that injustice, and we see the process by which they pursue it, and then ultimately they succeed or fail. And in that process, we actually emotionally feel for the people who've suffered the injustice and are on the side of the people trying to correct it. Now, the morality of the individual works radically differently, but emotionally it carries equal weight. This is the idea that we live in moral societies, i.e. societies in which it's defined to do good or bad. Now, the writer or the creator of a work, or in many instances the documentarist, actually discovers that a particular code of practice and morality actually exists in a particular community or a society. This is spelt out for the audience, so that the audience grasps very early on in the narrative what the difference between right and wrong is in this particular society or community, or in particular for a given individual, often the protagonist. Now, in this context, we're looking at what it is to do right or wrong. The reason this is important to us is because throughout our lives we make those choices almost daily. We know that there are certain things that are deemed to be right and certain things that are deemed to be wrong. We also know that society has mixed value systems, that some things in certain contexts are seen as bad, in other contexts are seen as good. Therefore, the choice is always with us. And it's the fact that we've made those choices all our lives, and often he's very uncertain about the choices we made, or even feel bad about some of the choices we've made. It means that, again, our emotional landscape is pockmarked and driven by a sense that we know the issue of what to do, whether we choose to do the right thing or the wrong thing is extremely important to us, and along with it comes a huge emotional charge. This stems obviously again from early childhood in most cases, but becomes far more complex as an adult as you weigh up the pros and cons of conflicting value systems. Narratives that deal with this, therefore, have an enormous emotional pull. They can be very simplistic, merely expressing the society's view of right or wrong at any given moment in time. In most cases, this will be an action-driven piece of work, where you have a very simple definition of a villain and a very clear view of who's in the right, and they set out to basically stop the villain or in fact kill them. These are very simplistic narratives, but they do absolutely engage with the question of morality of the individual, the choices you and I make every day. And the emotion is raw, just like it is in the desire for justice. Now, these two combined actually set out a relationship between individuals and the society, and therefore narratives that seek out justice or morality. We will talk later on in the podcast series about genre and see how these two actually work very hard to actually define and be the underpinning emotional core of the thriller genre. But for today, let's just stick to a few examples so you grasp fully the nature of the difference between the desire for justice and the questions of morality for individuals. The desire for justice is most obviously seen in courtroom drama, where you have an accused, you have someone trying to seek the truth in relation to that accusation, and you have the culprit, the person who actually committed the crime that the court seeks to uncover. Now, these are actually commonplace within television dramas. In fact, whole series of justice ministers and lawyers have been based on them almost since the start of television. Now, in cinema, we've entered an era where there are very few courtroom dramas. One suspects this is largely because television has colonized this idea. However, there are many examples from the past, ranging from 12 Angry Men to A Few Good Men, right the way through to The Client, where cinema has actually taken on the case of justice very clearly. The courtroom drama is the obvious one, but cinema is actually much better at looking at justice being sought in a community. So here you have things like Bad Day at Bladrock, the Australian film Shame, the Spanish conspiracy thriller Box 507. And at a more up-to-date scenario, you have issues around the morality of justice for individuals. So you get films about racism and sexism and pieces of work such as The Accused. Now these are very different in their emotional charge and what they seek to do, the narratives that are based on the theme of the morality of the individual. Of course, in most of the desire for justice films, morality is present. That's not what this is about. Here we're looking at the unifying emotion that underscores the work. Morality of the individual obviously plays a part in the narrative and plotting of many desire for justice narratives, but the morality of the individual is not the core of the film or the TV series. To see this, you have to look at such works as Murder on the Orient Express, or Seven, or Gone Baby Gone, where the central characters are all facing moral choices all the time, and that's the point. Here, we're not looking at uncovering the truth, the unfairness that was done at one point in time. We're looking at people making choices all the time, the moral choices they face as they uncover who did a crime, or they in fact try to discover something about themselves and the world they live in. This includes such classic westerns as The Searchers, or far more eccentric dramas like The Fisher King, and even as far as things like the Japanese Rashomon. Here we have the tale told 3 times of a highway robbery, and all the time we're looking at the morality of the individuals involved and who's telling the tale. In this context, as I said before, these emotions transcend all cultures and all time. Narratives will be constructed of them for the foreseeable future. They underpin narrative. And in the desire for justice and the morality of individuals, we look very closely at the world we live in and how we treat each other.